Here is one number that quietly explains the American economy. According to Moody's analytics, the top 10% of earners now account for 49.2% of all consumer spending. That is the highest share ever recorded. Nearly half of every dollar spent in America comes from just 1 in 10 households. But hold on to that number. By the end, you'll see why even economists can't agree if it's real. So who are they? In 2024, you needed an income of about $251,000 to crack the top 10%. That is roughly 13 million households. And their spending alone is worth about a third of the entire economy, a small slice of the country, carrying an enormous share of the load. Picture all consumers spending as a single bar. Moody splits it almost in half. 10% of earners on one side, the other 90% of the country on the other. A sliver of households, and nearly half of all the dollars. That is the claim that has economists talking and a little worried. Put it in everyday terms. Out of every $100 spent in America, about 49 now comes from the top tenth of earners. Walk through a busy store, and roughly half the sales ringing up at the register are driven by a small group at the very top of the income ladder. And this share keeps climbing. In 2020, the top 10% accounted for about 43% of spending. By 2025, it was just under 50. The economy didn't simply lean on the wealthy. Year after year, it leaned a little harder. Here is why that matters so much. Consumer spending is the economy. It makes up roughly 2/3 of America's gross domestic product. So when economists ask whether the country will keep growing, they are really asking one quieter question. Will people keep spending? As Moody's chief economist Mark Zandi put it, the economy has become increasingly dependent on the well-to-do. When a third of all growth rides on one group, their confidence stops being their problem alone. It becomes everyone's. And the gap between that group and everyone else is far wider than it sounds. Now watch the divergence. Between 2020 and 2025, spending by the top 10% grew 62%. The bottom 80% of the country barely kept pace with inflation. Same economy, same 5 years, two completely different trajectories. And the gap is not closing, it is still widening. Over the most recent 12 months, spending by the top earners grew more than 4%. For everyone else, it grew closer to 3%. That sounds small, but a gap that repeats every single year compounds, quietly, into the divide we just saw. Look at the households right in the middle, the 40th to 60th percentile. Their spending sits around $2.1 trillion, almost exactly where it was back in 2023. 2 years of life and effort, and the needle barely moved. And it isn't just the middle. For the entire bottom 80% of earners, households making under roughly $175,000 a year, spending has only kept pace with rising prices. 5 years of work, and in real terms, almost no gain at all. That is the squeeze, and 4 out of 5 households are living in it. And they feel it. In May 2026, the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index fell to 44.8, the lowest reading in the survey's entire history. Lower than the depths of the pandemic. Lower than 2022. The mood at the bottom does not match the headlines at the top. This is what worries economists. When the country's spending leans this heavily on one group, the economy's prospects start to rest on the fortunes of the well-to-do. If the wealthy stay confident, growth holds. But if they ever turn cautious, if the market scares them, the whole economy feels it. A narrow base is a fragile one. But to understand why that base is so narrow, you have to follow the money to where it actually sits. To understand why, follow the wealth, not just the income. The top 10% hold about 67% of all household net worth. The middle holds most of the rest. And the bottom half of the entire country holds only about 2%. That gap is the engine of everything we have seen. And for stocks, the gap is sharper still. The richest 10% own roughly 87% of all household stock market wealth. So when the market rises, almost all of that gain flows to the same households, the ones already doing the spending. Step back, and the picture is historic. The top 20% of households now hold about 72% of all the wealth in the country, the highest concentration since at least 1989. In the entire span of modern record-keeping, Wealth has rarely been this tightly held at the top. And the market did rise. By the third quarter of 2025, total U.S. household net worth hit a record $181.6 trillion. On paper, America had never, ever been richer. The question was always, richer for whom? A huge slice of that came from stocks. In 2025 alone, household stock holdings jumped 18%, a gain of more than $10 trillion to nearly $68 trillion. A historic surge in paper wealth, landing mostly in a narrow set of hands. Stocks now make up about 33% of all household wealth, a record. The American household has never been so tied to the market, which means the country's spending power now rises and falls with the stock ticker. This is the wealth effect at work. When your assets climb, you feel richer, so you spend more. But assets climbed for the people who own assets. Home values and portfolios did the lifting for the households that had them. No villain required. Just compounding math on an unequal base. The result is two moods inside one country. Tie your fortunes to the market, and you feel the boom. Tie them to a paycheck, and you feel the squeeze. Both are real. Both are happening at the very same time. And yet, here's the twist. The experts can't even agree on how big that divide really is. But here is the honest catch. Is it really half? The government's own statisticians say no. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, using its distributional accounts, puts the top 10% closer to 20% of spending, less than half of Moody's figure. So which is right? The truth is, it depends on how you measure it. The Federal Reserve has weighed in too. A Minneapolis Fed review found spending grew about 29% for low-income households and about 36% for high-income ones since 2020. A real gap, but a far smaller one than the headline, half of everything suggests. There is a middle ground number that almost everyone accepts. Widen the lens from the top 10% to the top 40% of earners, and you capture about 61% of all consumer spending. However you measure it, the spending in America tilts, clearly and consistently, toward the top. The New York Fed makes the cleanest point of all. What's concentrated at the top isn't necessarily the level of spending, it's the growth. The claim that the rich buy half of everything is contested. The claim that recent growth is driven by the top is not. And there is a more reassuring read, too. The top and the middle together still make up about 80% of all spending, and those households remain on fairly solid financial footing. One major bank still expects overall spending to grow around 2.8% in 2026. A K-shaped economy is lopsided, but it is not, on its own, a recession. Still, here is what nobody disputes. The top 10% own about 87% of all household stocks. So however you slice the spending, the economy's momentum now rides on asset prices held by a narrow few. That is the fragile part. When the wealthy are the spender of last resort, a strong year for stocks props up demand, and a bad one removes the prop. So maybe the headline number is 49%, and maybe it's closer to 20. But the shape is the same either way. America increasingly runs on two economies, and they are linked by one stock market. The next time the market sets a record, remember who actually owns it. This is descriptive data journalism, not investment advice. If you found it useful, subscribe. A new data story every day.